I think it is clear to believe in the power of ideas.
Fresh thinking to the Manhattan Institute.
Morning. Thanks for coming. I want to thank the Manhattan Institute for sponsoring this conference. I missed the first few minutes of the first session, but the last 20 or 30 were pretty good. I enjoyed it. I hope this panel is equally good. I was asked to serve as the moderator at this panel, so I'll start by introducing myself. My name is Adam Brodsky. I'm the deputy editorial page editor at the New York Post. I write editorials and edit editorials, and I have a column which reflects my own opinions. I cover a wide variety of subjects: terrorism, schools, economic development, crime, world affairs. But I also it turns out that I'm often the go-to guy on the editorial pages for budget issues, and that might explain why I'm here today. But it's not that I have any extensive experience in this area. I think it's really just that in the newspaper field, it's hard to find people who can even get just the basic facts of a budget story correct. So, they sometimes turn to me. I think that in the past few weeks, some of that has obviously changed. All of a sudden, everybody's interested in financial issues, and it seems that it's pretty amazing how you can get people's attention simply by wiping out their life savings or nationalizing the banks, or when you have a presidential candidate who every third word out of his mouth is the Great Depression, the Great Depression, the Great Depression. Suddenly, everyone's an expert on macroeconomics and fiscal policy. Today, the topic of this panel is balancing New York's books. I think it's a bit of false advertising because I think New York never balances its books. Not in the best of times, and certainly not in these times. Keeping stuff off the books, that New York can do. Hiding the books from the public, New York pals are good at that. Rewriting the books, fudging numbers, transferring costs to somebody else's books, we specialize in it. But balancing them in the strict sense of the phrase, it doesn't happen. Not in New York. So, but that's not really why we're here today. The way I see it, there are three questions we should address in light of the market meltdown. First is very simply, is the economy, locally and beyond, at risk, and will people be hurt? The second is, will government be able to pay its bills without raising taxes, without significant borrowing, and while continuing to provide roughly the same level of services? You can note that just on Monday, Governor Patterson said there was a $2.5 billion hole in the current year budget, state budget, and that nut is going to grow to $10 billion, as much as $10 billion next year. And also, just yesterday, Mayor Bloomberg said that there's no way we're going to avoid taxes pretty much on every single level of government. But the third question is really the most important, is can anything be done to mitigate the negative consequences inherent in the first two questions? Can we minimize the economic toll, avoid hardship, shore up economic underpinnings, and set the state on firm economic ground? Can we hold down taxes and debt, and at the same time keep from expanding the misery level among those who depend on public services? Our panelists today may offer some specific answers to these questions, but I'd just like to say that, to my mind, the wisest approach is to address these problems holistically, so to speak, to consider all the symptoms together as part of a whole, and assess potential remedies in terms of how all the symptoms, the contracting economy and the government cash crunch will be affected. Because these issues are obviously related. How successful you are in reviving the economy will certainly affect government's fiscal standing. And that's pretty obvious given that it's the economic chaos today that's causing problems for government in the first place. By the same token, rehabilitating the economy can at least theoretically alleviate government's woes. The flip side of that is that what we do to keep the public sector afloat, whether it's tax hikes or tax cuts, budget trims, stimulus packages, work programs, infrastructure investment, that will likewise shape the economy's future. So the two issues go hand in hand, and they should be considered that way. The strength of the links between government action and the economy and vice versa are open to debate. And it's also hard to estimate the effects of unintended consequences of government action, since, after all, they're unintended. But it's worth remembering that government programs are merely one part of the economy. They're services purchased with money earned through the hard work of the taxpaying public. Cure the economy, and there might be no need to do anything else to keep government whole. On the other hand, in the process of in the process of trying to salvage government, you wind up trashing the economy, then the whole exercise will have been in vain. So the stakes are pretty high, and the problem is complex, and the course ahead isn't necessarily obvious. But we do have three real experts here today who know precisely what to do. So without further delay, I'd like to invite them to make their presentations at that time, and then after we'll have a brief discussion and open questions to the floor. Our first panelist is Nicole Gelinas. Nicole's the Searle Freedom Trust Fellow at the Manhattan Institute, a contributing editor of City Journal. She writes on urban economics, municipal and corporate finance, business issues, and crime. She's a chartered financial analyst and a member of the New York Society of Securities Analysts. As many of us know, she's published just about anywhere they have printing presses: the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, the late New York Sun, the Daily News, and of course the most important paper, my paper, the New York Post, among others. We at the Post, by the way, we pretend that we discovered her, but anybody who's ever read anything she's written knows that you know right away that she's got broad knowledge and bright ideas, and particularly in finance, and she's a real asset for our paper. And I'm sure she'll have some great ideas to share with us today. So, Nicole?
Thank you. Good morning. 5 years ago, on August 14th, 2003, the lights went out all over the northeastern United States. Now, it only took a few moments for this to happen, but it took 3 to 5 days to get the lights back on. Why is that? Because once such a complicated infrastructure system goes down, it takes a little while to get it started up again. But at least in that case, the infrastructure to transmit electricity was not destroyed. And once the lights went back on, everybody went on with their life as before. The electricity was the same as it had been a week before. It's taken almost 2 years for the global risk capital markets to completely shut themselves down, come to a halt, in particular the credit markets over the past month. Nobody knows quite what those markets will look like once they've been restarted, once the private sector starts lending within the private sector again. But it's very clear that there's a real risk that the infrastructure here has been obliterated. The way through which credit has been transmitted, particularly over the last decade, is through global confidence in American financial engineering. It's very safe to say that that is not coming back anytime soon. Now, this is a very serious experiment for the entire nation, how this is all going to work out. But for New York City in particular, this global credit risk infrastructure and global capital markets infrastructure has driven our economy for the past 25 years. And there's a very serious risk that this is not just another cyclical downturn in a generally booming financial industry, that this is something different, that we are seeing a huge structural change in this industry, and in fact, a long-term decline in this industry as a share of the national economy. Now, as Amity said in the first presentation, people who graduated from college after 1982 until 2006, they really didn't know anything different from a booming Wall Street with a couple of years of exception within that. That's an important date because modern Wall Street really began in 1982, and people forget it's been such a long time that Wall Street has driven our economy, that it did not always do so. In fact, New York City and states were both very lucky starting in the early 80s that suddenly global finance took off and that New York was one of the chief beneficiaries of this. There were several reasons, just very quickly. Baby boomers were borrowing, they were investing in the stock market, the world was growing, capital barriers were falling. Globally, people wanted to put their money in dollar assets. The way to do that was to do it through New York City, and the rest of the world, while it was starting to have money, did not have very deep capital markets. New York and London were the only games in town, and that held up pretty much until 2006, and particularly over the last decade, Wall Street changed its business model to basically turning any long-term asset, a mortgage, but not only mortgages, into an instantaneously tradable security. The idea was that all securities could be instantaneously priced, could be amplified with tremendous amounts of debt. Every layer of debt carried an assumption under it. Every single assumption had to hold up or the whole thing would eventually collapse, as we saw. Now, this regeneration and secular growth of Wall Street as it started to take off in the national economy in the early 80s, this doubled, the financial industry in general doubled as a percentage of the nation's income. Once in the 80s, it did so again from the early 90s through 2006. This is what saved New York from the legacy of the 70s. The city almost went bankrupt in 1975, had its own federal bailout. And in the early 80s, New York was still suffering the effects of that. We still had vastly fewer sanitation officers, police officers. The city was not a wonderful place to live. It was only in the mid-80s where you start to see turnarounds in revenues. Mayor Ed Koch was able to say in the mid-80s, I'm finally hiring some more police officers, more sanitation officers, and you see this in the movies as well. Movies like Escape from New York turned into movies like Wall Street and Working Girl. Young, single people wanted to be in Manhattan. They were paying vast amounts of tax revenue, not demanding many services in return. Revenue started to go up. This set the stage for Giuliani to come along and do much of the rest of the job on the public safety, quality of life side. All throughout this era, broadly speaking, from 1982 to 2006, New York never had to make any decisions about guns and butter. We had tremendous amounts of revenue. We have never dealt with our structural budget issues. Today, we spend, when you adjust for population and inflation, we spend 22% more than we did at the height of the Lindsay era. We spend the same amount on, percentage-wise, on social services. The only thing that has masked these huge structural imbalances were unsustainable revenues coming from Wall Street. And what's happened is, particularly over the last decade, we've become even more acutely dependent on this issue, on this industry. In 2006, which was the last full year of this credit bubble, New York was getting a full third of its personal income, wages, salaries, and bonuses from the finance, insurance, and real estate industries. That was up from a quarter when this boom all started. In 2006, we were getting 50% of our personal income tax revenue from the top 1%, which is itself heavily dependent on Wall Street. That was up from a third a decade or so before. And in general, between 2000, which was the height of the tech bubble, and 2006, tax revenues in the city, after adjusting for inflation, went up 41%, which is something that the city has never ever seen before in its modern history. And it was not necessarily a good thing, because this just hid these huge structural imbalances. Over that same time period, costs on things like debt payments, pensions and healthcare benefits for public sector workers, and Medicaid. 1 in 4 New York City residents is on Medicaid. These costs have gone up after inflation more than 50%. They now make up 40% of the city's budget. Now, what does that mean? In a downturn, you can't immediately cut these costs. These costs take several years to see the effects of reform, so you've got to cut the rest of the budget. If you don't do that very, very carefully, and you wait till we have a panic situation with our own creditors, that's how you end up doing things like cutting police, cutting fire, cutting sanitation, and losing the middle class. So across the board, budget cuts are not the way to do. We need very well managed, targeted budget cuts. And just to give you an example, if we were to try to do these across the board budget cuts in the controllable part of the budget, as opposed to these debt, pensions, and everything else I just talked about, in 2 years' time, we would have to cut the police department by 15 to 20%. These types of cuts would gravely endanger New York's quality of life. So the important thing is just to understand that we have to start now figuring out not just we're going to cut 5% across the controllable budget and see what happens next year, but what can be expended and what can't. Now, the other point I wanted to make is that during our last two cyclical downturns in the early 2000s and then a decade before that, the lessons that we learned from those two experiences may actually work against us today. And those lessons were that it was okay for the city to raise taxes, at least temporarily, often permanently, and just wait for Wall Street to start booming again. Everything would go away. By the time the budget crisis actually got serious, it was gone because Wall Street was just taking off, doing better than before. The last time we raised taxes when our major industry was in structural decline, not expansion, you have to go back to the late 1960s and early 1970s when, I can read you a quote from the New York Times in the late 60s. As the soaring 60s were starting to peter out, the Times editorial board said, "Strong medicine, specifically higher taxes, is the remedy for restoring New York's financial health." And I'm not trying to point out that they were incorrect. Nobody knows the future. But the point was that they thought that they did not think that the city would lose half of its million manufacturing jobs. Back then, that was our major industry. By the time we figured this all out, it was a decade later. We were in the middle of an acute fiscal crisis, and it was too late to turn it around. We do not want to raise taxes this time, thinking that this is another temporary cyclical blip, and in 3 years from now, we find ourselves still waiting for tax revenues to turn around and find out that we've gotten ourselves into a much deeper hole. And now, of course, nobody can quantify the risk that this is a deep-seated structural change, but the risk is certainly there, and it's grave, and it is much better if we err on the side of meeting this risk today. The worst that will happen is if we take these steps today and Wall Street hopefully turns itself around, starts booming again. At least we will have set the basis for a more sustainable economy, looking toward future income tax cuts in particular, so that we can try to reduce our dependence on this one industry. In the long term, that is the one thing that we need to do to make sure that we're not sitting here with 35% of the city's income base dependent on this one very volatile industry. Thank you. Thank you all.
Well, that sets the tone. Pretty grim outlook, but it's maybe not hopeless. Our next panelist is John Cape. John is a nationally recognized expert on state finance and public policy with more than 30 years' experience in the public sector, including as budget director for Governor George Pataki. In that role, John headed New York's division of the budget, overseeing a $113 billion spending plan. He's also served as chairman of the state's Public Authority Control Board. We all love public authorities. And as a director of the Local Government Assistance Corporation. He's an ardent advocate of fiscal integrity and transparency. He's a senior fellow at the Rockefeller Institute of Government and a fellow of the State Academy of Public Administrators. He's also served on the executive board of the National Association of State Budget Officers. He's the 2006 recipient of the Center for Technology and Government's Rudolph W. Giuliani Leadership Award and the American Society for Public Administration's Charles Evans Hughes Award. He's based in Albany and here in the city as well. John co-leads a strategic consulting operation for state governments. John?
Thanks very much, Adam. I remember when I first became budget director in New York State, I came home one night and I said to my wife, look, you know, I'm at the pinnacle of my career. Did you ever imagine in your wildest dreams, honey, that, you know, you'd end up married to the state budget director? And she looked at me and said, John, I don't know how to tell you this, but you're not even in my wildest dreams. And I think that the events of the last few weeks certainly were never in the wildest dreams of many of the budget planners that have looked at New York State. So I'm the nerd in the middle of the panel here today, and want to talk to you a little bit about some of the numbers and some of the concepts, you know, that go into the state budget, and sort of pick up on a lot of the issues that Nicole raised, you know, with some boring charts that I will go through relatively quickly. You know, in Amity's opening, she mentioned something about the Great Depression. Interestingly enough, the first executive budget in New York was in 1929. It was proposed in January of 1929, and in the text of that first budget, the budget director talked about the inflated levels of stock prices, worried a lot about those kinds of issues posing a threat to long-term fiscal stability in the state. In the 1930 executive budget, that same budget director reported that the state would have exactly half the revenue that it had in 1929 to operate the government. So let's just sort of look at the good old days. And you'll see at the top here, this is the July update back when things were swell compared to now. And the next few slides that I'm going to go through are the most current published data, but I think we can all sort of add columns to the right that will look you know, a lot bleaker than these. As you can see, revenues had tracked down considerably just from the time in January when the executive budget was proposed. To the right of that red bar certainly is going to be a smaller revenue picture for the current year and for the out years. But just since the 2008-9 executive budget was forecast last year, revenues in New York State have, the forecast for them has dropped by $4 billion. Just in terms of looking at the percentage, you can see the go-go years of 2006-07, where we had 12% revenue growth, and now in the good old days of July, we had 1.6% revenue growth. This is a chart that illustrates where the budget gaps are coming from. The blue line is spending. The red line used to be the same as the blue line. You can see where it is now, and that's what gives you those budget gaps. This is the budget division's change in the bonus pool forecast. Again, this is for calendar year 2008, and it reflects the first quarterly update. I'm sure that there will be another deeper red bar to the right of this one, showing that a 20% drop in the bonus pool for the fire sector is what people were forecasting. You know, I think it's sort of safe to say that it is probably going to be worse than that. In terms of New York State's income tax, and EJ will talk about this a little bit, New York is one of the states most reliant on the personal income tax. Of that reliance, New York is one of the states that's most reliant on the thinnest slice of that tax base. About 45,000 of New York's 5.5 million taxpayers provide us with anywhere from 20 to 30% of our total income tax receipts. And that little tiny slice sort of breaks down into three parts. There's old money, the Rockefellers, the Vanderbilts, the E.J. McMahons. There's the new money, the people that are captains of industry, titans of industry in the state. And then there's so that's the middle money guys. And then there's new money. Those are the dot-com guys, the Wall Street titans, those kinds of people. We've also been migrating toward the new money, more volatile piece of that little piece of the pie. So we're in a position where we're very vulnerable to a shift in that small, tiny fraction of our tax base. This is capital gains forecast also coming down radically. This one is very tough to forecast. It's really hard to tell. Certainly people sold at a loss from the high, but whether that loss from the high is still above where they purchased at is anybody's guess. This is going to be a very volatile number that's going to be difficult to pin down. So, that's sort of the news from the good old days back in July. A little bit about what's coming. I think it is not going to be a great holiday retail season. You'll see, real deterioration and maybe even nominal deterioration in retail receipts in New York for the first time since 1991. We will certainly, with lower equity prices and more liquidity in the marketplace, see some merger and acquisition activity picking up. Others, you will see unwinding, and so there are going to be sort of countervailing forces against the small pockets of growth. I think, as all of the banking institutions start to settle into their new roles, and all of the mergers of the major financial institutions begin to solidify, you're going to see a slow, continued shrinkage, certainly in New York, of the financial services sector. So yes, there was some of the big hits when these mergers and acquisitions initially occurred, but I think there's more of a trickle yet to come that's going to go on for a long time. Foreign consumption, one of the things that's been holding up our retail market, our residential real estate market, to a lesser extent our commercial real estate market here in the city, to a lesser extent statewide and nationwide. With the global downturn and the strengthening of the dollar, there's a question about whether that part of the market that's been sort of holding us up will continue, and whether or not this crisis will sort of bleed over into commercial real estate, which is an area that can certainly extend the length of the financial downturn. The financial services sector, I agree with Nicole. I think we're going to end up with fewer, bigger banks that are going to be highly capitalized but highly regulated. Down at the bottom of the page, you see sort of the standard leverages of the banks in the various sectors, Fannie and Freddie, up over 70%. I think that you're going to see, as the big banks are more regulated, them migrate back toward that closer 10-to-1 leverage ratio. What does that mean? I think it means that less risk means less reward. I don't think you're going to see the big hit kinds of fees and profitability that we have seen in the recent years. And that's going to mean that compensation generally, and the bonus pool more specifically, will continue to be anemic for some time to go. Now, whether or not you see some of the financial institutions that emerge, certainly boutique firms, hedge funds, places like that, that will become sort of the new strength of a Wall Street, I think you'll find that Charlotte, North Carolina sounds just fine to some banks, and that Stamford, Connecticut, Greenwich, Connecticut sounds just fine to some other kinds of banking institutions that are going to emerge out of the ashes of the financial services sector that we knew last year. A factor in that will certainly be the tax levels in both New York State and New York City. And without that sort of historic allegiance to Wall Street and to Midtown and downtown Manhattan, I worry that we'll see more decentralization of the banking system that will migrate outside of New York and outside the reach of our tax base. And I think that You'll see a slow transformation of this industry. Again, I think over time you're going to see a new regulatory framework emerge. What that will do for top-line revenues and profitability in the industry, I think, is an unknown at this point. I think that it's going to take a year or two for a lot of this to shake out, and in the meantime, there's going to be a tremendous amount of revenue uncertainty, both for the state and the city. You know, there's the old saying that, you know, the plague was good for the gravedigger industry. I think there will be some bright spots here. There will be, you know, financial services managers that are hired to execute elements of the bailout that will also migrate over into the legal and accounting services. I think you'll see a fair amount of people suing each other. That's always good for the legal and accounting industry. And so, you know, and I think that as out of all of this activity, you will see sort of emerging players and emerging strategies that will be the basis for a revitalized financial services sector in New York and in the Northeast. So just what does all of this mean? Sort of taking it away, state revenues are going to take a huge hit, and that hit is going to feel different than it felt after 9/11 for a number of reasons. But let me start with a little context. We already talked about the heavy reliance of the income tax in New York. Of that reliance, it's heavily concentrated in New York's fourth fiscal quarter, that is January 1st to March 31st. And that is reflective of the high reliance on the financial services sector. New York gets about 35% of its income tax receipts in that final quarter. In nominal dollars, that's somewhere between $18 and $20 billion. Between $6 and $7 billion of that comes directly out of Wall Street. So while at the mid-year, probably New York's revenues will look okay, we know that they're looking down the barrel of the $6 or $7 billion that comes from the financial services sector in that final quarter. And the question is, how much of it will they really get? You know, this is why David Patterson, I think, has been a little circumspect, because I don't, you know, there's just too many moving parts to know exactly what it's going to be. But it's not going to be 6 or 7 billion. And so the state will get hit for a big chunk of revenue in that final quarter, and it will have very little time to do anything in terms of adjusting to it. Then and New York is the only state in the country with this odd fiscal year, on April 15th, 15 days into the new fiscal year, there'll be sort of the tail off of that as they get the final payments on 2008 liability, and then it will spread out as payments on extensions come in over the summer and the early fall. So I think that New York is going to take a huge fiscal hit. You don't see it yet, but everybody knows it's coming. I think that unlike right after 9/11, consumption is weak. Consumption sort of saved us last time. It's not going to save us now. Housing was strong last time. It's not going to save us now. I think unemployment is likely to hit 8% or worse in New York. There are, you know, out on the margins, analysis, economic forecasts for it to be much worse than that. I do think that the federal government budget constraints will also pose a constraint to how they can help the city and the state governments out of this crisis. I'm a little worried that Congress has been desensitized. I can't even say it. To the law of large numbers. And it's like, you know, 700 billion. It's like, it's the old phrase that I heard from my client out in Nebraska, which is, if you're going to get wet, you might as well go swimming. And, you need only look as far as what happened with the auto industry. I remember in my days when the auto industry, when the bailout of Chrysler captivated the headlines for weeks, and the auto industry got $25 billion and barely made the papers. So I think we do have to worry about some of that. These are the out-year gaps from the good old days. $6.4 billion in the next fiscal year, 9.3 after that, 10.6 after that. These gaps will certainly worsen, and so we're talking in the $7 to $8 billion range for the gap that people need to close. Let me just quickly go through some of these slides about what that means to the budget. This is New York State's budget. You can see the big red slice is local assistance. Then on the left, you see there is debt and capital, fringe benefits, and down on the bottom, state operations. If you were going to close $6.4 billion, you'd have to take $1 out of every $10 out of that entire pie. But if we throw out pension payments and debt service payments, the number quickly increases to over 12%, and remember, those are the old gaps. If you look at just getting it out of local assistance, the largest share of the pie, it goes up to 15%, and you can see the red smiley face on the bottom is education aid. That's going to be the major political battleground in New York. If you look at getting it out of the state workforce, here's some ideas about where that comes from. The big pieces in red are direct care workers in hospitals, public safety, correction officers and state police, and SUNY and CUNY staff that are tied to enrollment growth and tuition payments. All of the other slices there is where the majority of workforce changes have to come from. But, yeah. So if you had to balance a budget with $7 billion, I've put up this chart that's got something for everybody to hate. Federal aid, I'm on a call later today with the National Governors Association with my Oliver Twist routine about, please, sir, may we have some more? Workforce cuts, we can cut 5,000 out of the budget, 5,000 filled jobs. The last time we did that would be never. School aid, you can cut $1 billion. That's the political equivalent of passing a kidney stone in Albany. The famous whipping boy Medicaid, let's cut $1.5 billion out of that. Let's cut all of the other local government services. And you still have conservatively $1.6 billion left to go after all of that blood is on the floor, and the only place to turn to it is revenue. So in some way, shape, or form, there will be significant revenue actions in the budget. The next few slides simply set up EJ's next comments. The sooner you deal with this, the better. The longer you wait, the harder it'll be. Simply asking counties to spend more, the federal government to spend more, shifting this cost around is not going to be an effective budget policy. Nobody has resources to help the state out. If we can't afford 3 auto companies in this country, can we still afford these things? Can we still afford 1,000 hospitals? 62 prisons? Can we still afford all of the transmission loss where every bureaucrat between Washington and the recipient touches all of the federal money that goes through those slides? The bottom line is you can't borrow your way out of this, you can't tax your way out of it, and as Nicole rightly pointed out, you can't across the board cut your way out of it. So governing is choosing, and this is a real opportunity for people in New York. A fiscal crisis is a terrible thing to waste. Hopefully, the policymakers won't waste it. Thank you.
Well, I think we went from grim to hopeless. Our final panelist is, I just learned, a billionaire. He's the irreplaceable E.J. McMahon. If you read the papers, you can sometimes wonder how anybody has a clue about what's going on on the budget scene in New York without, if it weren't for E.J.'s comments. Anytime there's a news story with even the most remote budgetary implications, folks like me in the news business race to the phone to get E.J.'s take. Officially, he's the director of the Empire Center for New York State Policy, a Manhattan Institute project. He's also senior fellow for tax and budgetary studies at MI's Center for Civic Innovation. His work is focused on public pension reform, competitive contracting for public services, Governor Pataki's fiscal record. He too has been published pretty much everywhere, and he's quoted in even more places than that. His professional background includes more than a quarter century as an Albany-based policy analyst with stints as Deputy Commissioner for Tax Policy Analysis and Counselor to the Commissioner in the state's Department of Taxation and Finance, Director of Minority Staff for the State Assembly Ways and Means Committee, and Vice Chancellor for External Relations at the State University of New York. At one point in his career, he was a lowly newspaperman like me, so maybe there's hope for me yet. E.J.?
Thank you, Adam. As Adam's little quick bio sketch revealed, until I arrived at the Manhattan Institute, I was unable to hold a job. Thankfully, that's over. You've also revealed that I'm a man of means. In the current market situation, the five-figure family fortune is quickly dwindling, however. And so I'm going to do my best to explain what we need to do to get ourselves out of this. I, too, may end up drawing a picture that you take as rather gloomy, and so I want to quickly put out a caveat right now for everybody in the room. Now, despite everything you now hear, I want you to keep in mind that it's worse in New Jersey. Just keep that in mind, keep that truism in mind, and everything you'll be able to sleep better. I think I'm going to focus on the state also, and I know that there's probably a tendency in the room here to think about Albany as a cold and distant and somewhat irrelevant place that you thankfully don't have to go to very much, although I live there and I think it's quite nice. However, you need to keep in mind that in terms of New York City and the future of New York City, virtually no important decision about the finances of New York City will be made without passing through Albany. And that it's also true for a lot of important decisions that have a bearing on how much the city spends and how it's managed. And so this has a great deal of relevance to the future of everyone in the city as well as in the state. I'm going to focus on I'm going to start with one of my own favorite charts for illustrating what the situation is. And before I put it on, let me just explain what's going on here from my own point of view. There's a twin challenge for both the city and the state and for all downstream local governments of the state as well. We're entering a recession. Who knows how long it will last, how severe it will be, but recessions are trouble for government. A downturn is a problem for all governments, even relatively lean, small governments out west that depend on, taxes that look minuscule by our standards. It's a problem. Recessions are a problem. There's another thing going on here that make this not just another cyclical downturn for New York. And as has been referenced earlier, and as I'm going to get into, that is a fundamental shift in one of New York's key industries. Wall Street has always been, obviously for a century or more, Wall Street has been a well-known, important feature of the economy of New York City and New York State. It's only in the last 25 years that Wall Street has grown into such a hugely important part of the state's financial base. And that's particularly in the last 15 years. This chart does as good a job of any I could come up with, of illustrating what I mean by that. The red line on the bottom is employment in the securities industry in New York State. Now, most of this is in the city, not all of it. That hasn't changed much. It's been 2 to 3%. This is 30 years. Hasn't changed much. And it remains a relatively small share of the jobs, but the share of total wages in the state, including bonuses and salaries, represented by securities industry jobs, Wall Street, has skyrocketed from just over 2% 30 years ago to nearly 1/5 last year. Now, as John, as a former budget director, can tell you, this is real coin of the realm. This is money that's taxed completely at the margins. as I'll show on other charts. This is 212,000 people making this nearly $80 billion worth of wages and salaries last year. The other 7 million workers in New York State have a lot of their income taxed at much lower levels, or not taxed at all. But on average, a very small portion of a typical worker's income is taxed completely at the margin by New York State, and for city residents, New York City. This is all taxable marginal income, so it plays an outsized role in the state's finances. And here's another chart that's frequently seen that kind of reflects another aspect of that. This is the annual waiting game. It's like played in Albany, like waiting for the envelope in the mailbox, is waiting to see what the Wall Street bonuses will be. It's not only guys in the investment banking industry who would wait eagerly every year, obsessing over their bonuses and wondering when they would come in and how big they would be. Albany was also obsessed with it, even to a greater extent than New York City, because again, Albany taxed all of this at the margin. Basically, every $1 billion in bonuses meant $70 million in state tax revenues. So you can see that that chart speaks for itself. I don't have to describe it at greater length either. Here's yet another way of looking at it, and again, this is very telling. The average wage in the securities industry in New York State last year, which will be known as the last year of anything like this for quite some time, these is 212,000 people making an average of $379,000 each. That's everybody from the mailroom up to, the CEO. Now, again, you have to keep in mind 30 years ago and even 25 years ago, going back to that early chart I had, the average wage in the securities industry was always a well-paying place to work, investment banking, banking in general. But the average wage until the early 80s was a little more than double the average private sector wage. It was well-paying, but it wasn't that well-paying. As of last year, the industry was paying more than 6 times the average private sector wage. Indeed, that's an average that's pumped up by the presence in it of the securities industry. If you look at the average for all other jobs, it's 7 or 8 times the average. That's extraordinary. And again, it's all golden. Albany and anybody collecting taxes looks at that and just gets excited. They got all tingly whenever they would see the money start rolling in and the bonuses start being calculated. And those numbers supported what I'm showing here. New York State has had a personal income tax going back to the teens. It was one of the very, very few states that had an income tax before the Great Depression. But up to the late 70s, the income tax was less than half of its total tax revenue. And then what happened with this extraordinary growth, largely in securities industry compensation driving it, is that our reliance on the income tax has grown. Now, by the way, at several intervals in the life of this chart, the state did major rate cuts. At the beginning of this chart, when that bar was less than 45%, the top state income tax rate was 15%. In the middle of this chart, it was still around 9%. Now it's slightly below 7%. And we're harvesting nearly 60% of our total tax revenues from the income tax. That's not a good thing, needless to say. But that's what all this led to. And the final analysis, this is the result in terms of the budget. This is inflation-adjusted spending, 2008 dollars. And as you can see, the state funds budget, which is everything the state has to raise money to support, excluding federal aid, has grown tremendously over this period. There was an extraordinary growth period during the last 5 years, including Governor Pataki's last term, and as John would point out, several $1 billion of that growth was achieved over Governor Pataki's veto, so that in his final year in office, the state funds budget grew by 11%, which was the largest single-year budget growth on an inflation-adjusted basis since Nelson Rockefeller's last year in office. Now, the money was coming in so fast that even with that increase in spending, Pataki left Eliot Spitzer with a cash surplus of over $3 billion. Was it so 3.5, 3, something like that's, in other words, even with all that spending, they left a surplus. What was driving the budget? Well, we'll get to that in a minute, but I want to kind of have a little bit of a summing up now also. So this is the point we've arrived at. This is an Another name for this chart is, this is the chart you would find under the word unsustainable in the dictionary. You can't sustain this. Everybody knew you couldn't sustain it. In fact, over the last few years, the state budget itself had numerous phrases and warnings and risk statements pointing out that it couldn't be sustained. And now we're going to live that experience. What are we looking at? And we're talking about the securities industry in particular. We're looking at a recession. Yes, recessions are always bad for governments and government revenues. It creates problems for them, yes. But to a greater degree, we have the end of Wall Street as we knew it. As we've been saying, what are we seeing now? We're going to see a financial sector that is leaner, that is more heavily regulated, that is more risk averse, and thus, last but not least, is more sensitive to the high cost of doing business in New York, which includes the high tax burden in New York. So this is, to use the overused phrase, a perfect storm of problems for the city and the state in terms of their finances because we've become so heavily dependent. In other words, there will be a recovery. The economy will recover, hopefully sooner rather than later. But none of us can predict the future with certainty. But if we had to bet, the consensus would be, as I think David Malpass even reflected, is that we'll hit bottom early next year and that there'll be a sort of there'll be a recovery. The forces will be at play to bring about a general economic recovery. But for the city and state, this industry that I've been talking about, that we've all been talking about, is not coming back the way it used to be. That's the big difference between this and the last 2 or 3 downturns the state experienced. Policymakers, like many people, tend to fight the last war and tend to make decisions looking in the rearview mirror. And the problem is that to a great extent, many of us are not convinced that many of the elected officials are responsible for making decisions about how to proceed now actually understand that the good old days are not coming back in that fashion. What's been driving the budget? We could be here all day discussing that. I want to call your attention to several things. School aid is an enormous part of the budget, as John just showed. We've had an extraordinary run-up in school aid in recent years. And keep in mind that New York State spends more per pupil in its public schools than any state perennially, going back decades. Its only rivals are New Jersey and Connecticut, and all 3 of them are 40 to 50% above the national average. And the perennial 4th state, Massachusetts, it's quite a bit behind us. So I think it's now about 13,000. I neglected to check the figure. Maybe it's 14. We already spend a lot. We have always spent a lot. And the state aid to public schools has gone up at a significant rate. 76% in the last 10 years, 29% in the last 3 years. And one reason we've got a budget problem, it's not just on the revenue side, is that the baseline in the governor's budget right now calls for another 29% growth over the next 3 years. That is not going to, we can't allow that to happen. It's just, the money is just not there. Medicaid is something we talk about endlessly in New York because everybody who pays any attention to New York's finances knows we have an extravagant, grossly expensive Medicaid program that spends twice as much per recipient as the national average and as much as Texas and Florida combined. Interestingly, if you look at the growth path of Medicaid, if I went back even further, Medicaid didn't grow at all in the second half of the 1990s. It was just completely flat. Then it grew significantly up from 2000 through 2007, in part as a result of a resurgence of healthcare inflation and in part as a result of the Healthcare Reform Act changes that Governor Pataki spearheaded during that period, which vastly expanded the program on top of that healthcare inflation. But look at the recent years. Actually, another thing that was partially bequeathed by Pataki to Spitzer was a slowdown of growth in Medicaid, and in fact, in the Governor Spitzer's first fiscal year, Medicaid spending did something very unusual. It actually declined. And then this current year, it's not going up much. So it's not what's been driving the budget during the most recent 3 years. By the way, that was a national phenomenon related to a lot of things. A lot of states had no growth in Medicaid in recent years. Again, Medicaid is now projected to start growing at a pretty fast pace again, boosted in the case of New York by our decision to vastly expand, for instance, our Child Health Plus program up to middle class levels. We've managed to achieve, we've managed the feat of regulating and pricing the small group and individual health insurance market practically out of existence and thus making more people anxious to get into government-funded programs who normally in most states would not be anywhere near a government-funded program. But here's a chart that's really interesting. Basically, this is public pension contributions at every level of government in New York, including the city of New York, which is the biggest part of the bar, the New York school districts outside New York City, which have a separate retirement system, and then the red bar, which is the statewide retirement system for all other workers at every level of government in New York State, other than teachers, outside New York City. And what you can see here is we had this artificially low level of spending on pensions. Public pensions are, needless to say, very generous. They're constitutionally guaranteed, and they're a far better deal than anybody could get in the private sector, even when the private sector was still offering pensions. However, they were artificially cheap due to the market performance in the late 90s until the beginning of this decade. So essentially, public pension costs in New York have increased almost tenfold since 2000. Almost tenfold. You've gone from 900